Laredo, Texas, June 1914. The South Texas heat doesn't just warm you up, it bakes you to your damn bones. The air smells like dust, mesquite smoke, and incoming trouble. Down the main street of Laredo, a squad of Texas Rangers comes riding up. In 1914, if the Texas Rangers showed up at your doorstep, you didn't offer them lemonade. You prayed. These guys weren't the heroic cowboys populating pop culture mythology. In the Texas borderlands, they were feared as state-sanctioned enforcers who carried Winchester rifles, worn leather holsters, and an utter lack of respect for anyone with brown skin or a big mouth. Their target? A small independent newspaper office called El Progreso. Their mission? Demolish it. Break the printing presses into scrap metal, toss the inkwells into the dirt, and send a crystal clear message to the locals. Keep your mouths shut. The Rangers dismount, clank up the boardwalk, and stride toward the front door, fully expecting to find a panicked crew of printers sneaking out the back. They expect cowering. They expect tears. They expect to unleash hell and be home in time for supper. Instead, they hit a solid brick wall wrapped in a high-collared dress. Standing right in the doorway, blocking the entire entrance, is 29-year-old Hovita Edar, 5'0" of pure, unadulterated Tehana steel, arms crossed, spine straight as a rifle barrel, staring directly into the eyes of armed men who were accustomed to making grown men shake in their boots. The lead ranger looks at this young woman, chuckles under his breath, and tells her to step aside so they can smash her office to pieces. Hovita doesn't blink. She doesn't flinch. She just looks him up and down and says, essentially, "Over my dead body." Welcome to Audacious History, where we celebrate the historical figures who took one look at systematic injustice and said, "Not today, sweetheart." Today, we are telling the legendary, criminally underrated story of Hovita Edar, teacher, nurse, secret weapon journalist, and absolute badass of the Texas border. Hang on tight, because before Hovita stood on that porch facing down loaded rifles, she had already survived revolution, mob violence, and a system rigged against her people. Here is how one Tehana writer turned the press into a weapon and made the Texas Rangers eat their words. To understand how Hovita Edar grew the kind of spine required to block a squad of state-sanctioned gunmen, you have to understand the world she was born into. Hovita was born in Laredo, Texas in 1885. Laredo sits right on the edge of the Rio Grande. It's a place where the border didn't just split two countries, it split families, cultures, and daily life. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 had redrawn the map, suddenly turning thousands of Mexicans into American citizens overnight. The famous phrase goes, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." Hovita was raised in a household where quiet compliance was considered a sin. Her father, Nicasio Idar, was an activist, a leader in the Mexican-American community, and the publisher of a popular Spanish-language newspaper called La Crónica. Nicasio's living room wasn't just a living room, it was a political war room. While other kids in the 1890s were playing marbles, Hovita and her 7 brothers and sisters were sitting around the dinner table debating constitutional rights, press freedoms, and border politics. Nicasio made sure all his children, sons and daughters alike, were highly educated, politically aware, and fluent in the power of the written word. And make no mistake, that power was desperately needed. Because in South Texas, around the turn of the 20th century, Mexican Americans were living under a brutal system of segregation commonly known as Juan Crow. Just like Jim Crow in the Deep South, Juan Crow was designed to keep non-white populations disenfranchised, uneducated, and economically dependent. Mexican Americans were stripped of their ancestral lands through trickery and intimidation. They were forced into segregated, underfunded schools. They were banned from white-owned businesses, hotels, and restaurants. And if anyone dared to complain about it, well, that's where the Texas Rangers came in. Let's dispel the Hollywood fairy tale right now. The Texas Rangers of this era were not heroic, noble peacekeepers protecting the frontier. Historically, they functioned as an arm of state intimidation. They enforced white supremacy with shocking violence. Extrajudicial killings, beatings, and lynchings of Tehana residents were horrifyingly common. If a Tehana family had land a white rancher wanted, or if a Mexican-American worker spoke up for better wages, the Rangers were often deployed to settle matters with bullets. Hovita saw all of this growing up. She saw the land theft. She saw the segregation. She saw the bodies hanging from oak trees that no one was allowed to talk about in public. And instead of crushing her spirit, it lit a fire in her belly that would burn for the rest of her life. She decided early on that she wasn't going to be a silent bystander to her people's oppression. She was going to fight back. First, she thought she'd do it with chalk and blackboard erasers. But she was about to learn that the system didn't want her teaching, it wanted her quiet. In 1903, at 18 years old, Hovita earned her teaching degree from the Holding Institute in Laredo. She was young, idealistic, and ready to shape the minds of the next generation. She took a teaching job in Los Ojuelos, a small rural community outside Laredo. She walked into that classroom expecting to teach grammar, history, and literature. What she actually found horrified her. The schoolhouse was little more than a dilapidated shack. The roof leaked when it rained, the floorboards were rotting, and there were literally not enough chairs for the kids to sit on. There were no textbooks, no writing slates, no paper, no pencils. The state of Texas was pouring massive tax dollars into pristine white schools in town while leaving Mexican-American children to sit in cold shacks without basic supplies. Hovita tried to make it work. She spent her own tiny paycheck buying paper and pencils for her students. She brought blankets from home to keep them warm in winter. But every single day, she stared at those kids and realized a painful truth. This wasn't an accident. The school system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. The state didn't want these kids educated. If they learned to read, write, and understand the law, they'd demand their rights. They'd demand their land back. They'd vote. Hovita realized that as a school teacher, she was being asked to manage poverty, not solve it. She was being paid peanuts to keep kids quiet in a broken system. And Hovita Edar was done being quiet. So she made a radical choice. She quit teaching. She walked out of the classroom, packed her bags, and went straight back home to Laredo. If the state wouldn't let her teach children inside a classroom, fine. She'd teach the entire damn state of Texas through the newspaper press. Back in Laredo, Hovita joined her father and brothers, Clemente and Eduardo, at La Crónica. Now, in the early 1900s, female journalists were about as common as snowstorms in Laredo. The media world was dominated almost entirely by men. Hovita didn't care. She began writing articles under pen names, most notably A.V. Negra, the Black Bird, so readers wouldn't immediately dismiss her commentary because of her gender. And under that pseudonym, Hovita unleashed absolute fire. She wrote blistering op-eds exposing the horrific lynchings of Mexican Americans across Texas. She called out white land grabbers for stealing property from Tehana families. She blasted the Texas government for intentionally underfunding Mexican schools. And she didn't just attack external racism. She also turned her lens inward, scolding Mexican-American men who treated women like second-class citizens within their own communities. In 1911, things hit a terrifying boiling point. A 14-year-old Mexican boy named Antonio Gomez was arrested in Thorndale, Texas, after a minor altercation with a white man. Before he could even see a judge, an angry white mob dragged the child out of his jail cell and lynched him in broad daylight. The horror of Antonio Gomez's murder sent shockwaves through the Tejano community. Most people were terrified into silence. But the Idar family? They got pissed off. Nicasio, Hovita, and her brothers decided that complaining in the paper wasn't enough anymore. They needed to organize. They needed to build a unified front against the terror state. In September 1911, the Idar family organized El Primer Congreso Mexicanista, the first Mexicanist Congress in Laredo. This was a massive, unprecedented civil rights convention. Hundreds of Tejano journalists, teachers, activists, laborers, and community leaders flooded into Laredo from all across Texas and northern Mexico. They gathered to discuss legal defense strategies, fight back against land theft, address educational inequality, and end the extrajudicial killings by the Texas Rangers. And Hovita was right in the center of it. At a time when women were expected to sit in the back row and pour the coffee, Hovita was taking the stage, delivering speeches, and pushing women's rights to the forefront of the civil rights agenda. Right after the Congress, Hovita founded La Liga Femenil Mexicanista, the League of Mexican Women, and served as its very first president. This wasn't just a social club for tea and gossip. La Liga was an activist powerhouse. Under Hovita's leadership, these women raised money to buy school supplies and clothing for impoverished Mexican-American children. They offered free tutoring, established bilingual adult education programs, provided legal aid for victims of police violence, and published essays advocating for women's suffrage. Hovita was building a movement. But just as her work in Texas was reaching a fever pitch, a bloody nightmare erupted right across the border that would push her straight into an actual war zone. History has a terrible habit of forgetting the people who actually did the heavy lifting just because they didn't fit into the neat, comfortable stories we like to tell. Do me a favor and support independent history storytelling by hitting that subscribe button. Done it? Awesome! Now let's get back to Hovita because things are about to get real bloody real fast. By 1913, the Mexican Revolution was raging across the Rio Grande. Mexico was engulfed in a brutal, violent civil war as revolutionary forces fought to overthrow dictatorial control. Because Laredo sat right on the border, the war wasn't some distant headline. It was happening literally within eyeshot. Right across the river in Nuevo Laredo, the fighting reached a horrific crescendo in January 1913. The Mexican Federal Army and revolutionary rebels engaged in a devastating, bloody battle for control of the city. Cannons roared, machine guns sprayed bullets through the streets, and buildings burst into flames. The air across the river in Laredo smelled of gunpowder and burning wood. When the dust settled, Nuevo Laredo was a slaughterhouse. Hundreds of young soldiers and innocent victims lay dying in the streets. Hospitals were bombed out or completely overwhelmed. There were no doctors, no bandages, and no medical supplies left. Enter Leonor Villegas de Magnon, a wealthy Tehana activist who decided to form La Cruz Blanca, the White Cross, a neutral volunteer medical relief organization similar to the Red Cross, specifically designed to treat wounded revolutionaries and civilians. And who do you think was one of the very first women to volunteer to march straight into the war zone? You guessed it, Hovita Edar. Hovita didn't hesitate. She grabbed medical supplies, crossed the international bridge into the smoking ruins of Nuevo Laredo, and walked right onto the blood-soaked battlefield. For weeks, Hovita worked in horrific conditions. She wasn't sitting safely in a clinic background. She was in dirty, makeshift field tents, performing triage under the blazing sun. She bandaged bullet wounds, held men down while field surgeons performed amputations without proper anesthesia, cleaned infected compound fractures, and held the hands of teenage soldiers as they breathed their last breath. And it wasn't just blood she had to deal with. It was armed, angry soldiers. On multiple occasions, armed men from opposing factions would stomp into the field hospitals, rifles drawn, demanding to execute wounded enemy soldiers lying in the cots. Hovita and her fellow nurses would physically step between the barrels of the guns and the wounded men, shouting down hardened soldiers and demanding they respect the neutrality of the White Cross. She stared down men holding loaded weapons and told them to get the hell out of her hospital. And surprisingly, it worked. They backed down. By the time Hovita returned home to Laredo later that year, she had seen the absolute worst of human nature. She had watched young men bleed out in the dust. She had smelled burning flesh. She had looked loaded rifles in the face and refused to step aside. So by the time 1914 rolled around, if anyone thought they were going to intimidate Hovita Edar with a badge and a gun, they had another thing coming. 1914. The geopolitical climate along the border was a powder keg waiting for a match. In April of that year, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson ordered American military forces to invade and occupy the Mexican port city of Veracruz. Wilson claimed it was to protect American interests and stop arms shipments. But to the people of Mexico and the millions of Mexican Americans living in Texas, it was seen as a blatant imperialist act of aggression. The border region exploded with outrage. Protests erupted. The U.S. government and the state of Texas became hyper-paranoid about anti-American sentiment along the border. They began cracking down hard on any press or public speaker criticizing President Wilson. At this time, Hovita had started writing for a new independent Laredo newspaper called El Progreso. Now, Hovita knew the risks. She knew the Texas Rangers and federal agents were watching border publications like hawks, itching for an excuse to shut them down. But Hovita Edar didn't do cautious. She picked up her pen and authored a fierce, uncompromising editorial criticizing President Woodrow Wilson's military intervention in Veracruz. She slammed the invasion as illegal, hypocritical, and imperialist. She argued that the United States had no right to butcher Mexican citizens across the border while systematically abusing Mexican Americans at home. It was a brilliant piece of journalism. It was also, as far as the Texas authorities were concerned, high treason. When the editorial hit the streets, the local authorities lost their collective minds. The governor of Texas and the leadership of the Texas Rangers were furious. An outspoken Tehana writing articles mocking the President of the United States? In their state? Absolutely not. The order was dispatched to the local squad of Texas Rangers. Shut down El Progreso. Destroy the press. Make sure Hovita Edar never writes another word. Which brings us right back to where our story began. It's a hot afternoon in June 1914. The heavy thud of leather boots echoes on the wooden boardwalk outside the El Progreso building. A squad of Texas Rangers, big, intimidating men wearing wide-brim hats, heavy belts, and holding Winchester rifles, marches toward the front entrance. These guys were used to people scattering like roaches when they showed up. Usually, when the Rangers rolled up to a minority-owned business, people fled out the back door or fell to their knees begging for mercy. They expected to walk in, smash the iron printing machinery with sledgehammers, scatter the type across the dirt, burn the papers, and ride off into the sunset. They march up the wooden steps, ready to kick the door down, except the door isn't locked. It's wide open. And standing right in the center of the threshold, framing the doorway like a shield, is Hovita Edar. She doesn't have a gun. She doesn't have a club. She has her high-collared dress, her arms folded tightly across her chest, and a glare cold enough to freeze water in the middle of a Texas summer. The lead ranger stops dead in his tracks. He looks at her, then looks past her into the office, expecting to see male guards or printers hiding behind her skirts. But there's nobody there, just Hovita. The lead ranger steps forward, clears his throat, and snarls. "Move aside, ma'am. We have orders to destroy this press." Hovita doesn't shift an inch. She looks him dead in the eye and replies, "You are not coming in." The ranger's jaw tightens. He's not used to being talked to like this, especially not by a woman, and definitely not by a Mexican-American woman. He rests his hand heavily on the butt of his pistol, trying to use raw physical intimidation. "Ma'am, you don't understand. We represent the state of Texas. Move out of the doorway, or we will remove you." Now, most people would have panicked right there. These were men who had literally murdered people for looking at them sideways. But remember, Hovita had spent months knee-deep in real artillery fire in Nuevo Laredo, holding together broken soldiers with her bare hands. A few angry white boys with badges and little egos. That was practically a calm Tuesday for her. Hovita stands her ground, raises her voice so the gathering crowd on the street can hear every single word, and delivers a masterclass in constitutional law. She says, "You are violating the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. This press is protected under the law. You have no legal warrant. You have no right to enter this building, and I will not step aside." She basically told them, if you want to smash this press, you are going to have to physically assault and shoot an unarmed woman on the main street of Laredo in broad daylight while the entire town watches. The Rangers look around. A crowd of local residents is beginning to gather at the edge of the street. Men and women are watching. The Rangers are trapped in a hilarious, deeply embarrassing dilemma. If they shoot or drag this prominent 29-year-old woman off the porch, they will start an absolute riot on the streets of Laredo, and the press coverage will make them all look like complete monsters nationwide. But if they walk away, they've just been humiliated by a woman in a high-collared dress. The lead ranger looks at Hovita. Hovita looks back at him, her posture unfazed. Seconds tick by. The silence on the street is suffocating. You could hear a pin drop in the Texas dust. Finally, the lead ranger grunts, spits on the ground, turns around, and shouts to his men, "Let's go!" They mounted their horses and rode off down the street, empty-handed, humiliated, and utterly defeated by one woman standing in a doorway. Hovita Edar had just stood down the most feared law enforcement agency in the American West, using nothing but pure, unadulterated moral authority and a spine of solid steel. Now, because this is the Texas Rangers we're talking about, you know they couldn't just take their loss and move on like adults. They had their little feelings hurt. The very next morning, before sunrise, when they knew the street was deserted and Hovita wasn't there, a group of rangers snuck back into the El Progreso building like absolute cowards. They broke down the door in the dark, rushed inside with sledgehammers and crowbars, and systematically destroyed the printing presses. They smashed the iron frames, dumped the ink vats across the floor, smashed the type boxes, and burn the paper stock. They left the office looking like a bomb had gone off, giggling to themselves, thinking, "There, that'll finally shut her up." When Hovita walked in that morning and saw the destruction, do you think she cried? Do you think she quit? Hell no! She looked at the wreckage, probably rolled her eyes at how petty they were, and immediately went back to work. If the Rangers thought smashing one machine would stop Hovita Edar, they grossly misunderstood how printing presses worked. Hovita simply walked back over to her family's paper, La Cronica, picked up a pencil, and kept right on writing. She continued to publish articles attacking police brutality, demanding equal rights for Tejanos, and championing women's suffrage. The Rangers had destroyed some iron and lead, but they hadn't touched the mine behind it. By 1917, Hovita married Bartolo Juarez and moved to San Antonio, Texas. And if you think settling down meant slowing down, you don't know Hovita. In San Antonio, she immediately dove right back into activism. She co-founded a weekly newspaper called El Heraldo Cristiano. She established a free kindergarten for low-income Mexican-American children so they could get an education without suffering the discrimination she had witnessed as a young teacher in Los Ojuelos. She also volunteered at the Robert B. Greene Memorial Hospital, working as a Spanish language interpreter for patients who didn't speak English, making sure they weren't neglected or mistreated by the white medical staff. Until her death in 1946 at the age of 61, Hovita Edar never stopped fighting. She was a journalist, a teacher, a nurse, an activist, and a relentless thorn in the side of anyone who tried to abuse their power. For decades, mainstream history books completely ignored Hovita Edar. They preferred to tell stories about heroic Texas Rangers conquering the wild frontier, conveniently leaving out the Tehana woman who held those same Rangers accountable to the law. But you can't erase a legacy that strong. In 2023, the United States Mint officially honored Hovita Edar by placing her portrait on an American quarter as part of the American Women Quarters program. The design cleverly features her body composed of the very words she used to fight for her people: teacher, journalist, activist, equal rights. Hovita Edar showed us that courage doesn't always look like a man with a gun. Sometimes courage is a woman with a pen, a voice, and the utter refusal to step out of the doorway when justice is on the line. Thank you so much for watching Audacious History. What did you think of Hovita Edar's badass standoff? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss another story of history's most audacious figures. Until next time, friends, stay audacious.